The gunshot echoed across the plains of Wyoming Territory in 1876, silencing the birds and sending a shiver through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek. Nathan Irving lowered his smoking revolver, his face a weathered mask of stone as the body of his wife's murderer crumpled to the ground. The townsfolk who had gathered to witness the showdown stood in stunned silence, none daring to approach the fearsome rancher whose reputation had been built on both his fairness and his fury. That day marked the last time anyone in Redemption Creek saw Nathan Irving smile. 5 years passed, and the once jovial rancher became known as Stoneface Irving, a man who ran his cattle operation with efficiency, but spoke only when necessary, his eyes perpetually shadowed by the brim of his hat. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the Irving ranch as Nathan saddled his horse. At 42, he still moved with the fluid grace of a younger man, his tall frame lean and muscular from years of hard work. His beard, once trimmed neatly, had grown wilder, streaked with gray that matched the silver threads winding through his dark hair. The lines etched around his eyes told of squinting into the sun and of grief that never fully healed. "Pa?" The soft voice belonged to his daughter, Eliza. At 23, she was the spitting image of her mother, the same golden hair, the same determined chin. She'd taken over running the household after her mother's death, proving herself as capable as any ranch hand when it came to hard work. "Heading into town," Nathan replied, not turning around as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. "We need supplies." "I'll come with you," Eliza said, already wearing her riding clothes. "Mrs. Peterson sent word that the new schoolteacher has arrived. I thought I might introduce myself." Nathan merely nodded. Redemption Creek had been without a proper teacher for nearly 8 months. The last one, a nervous young man from Boston, had lasted barely a season before the harsh realities of frontier life sent him scurrying back east. The ride to town was quiet, broken only by the occasional comment from Eliza about the cattle or the weather. Nathan responded with nods or single words, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a habit born from years of vigilance in dangerous territory. Redemption Creek had grown in the past 5 years. What had once been little more than a trading post now boasted a proper main street with a general store, a small hotel, a bustling saloon, and even a church that doubled as a schoolhouse. Progress had come in the form of telegraph wires and promises of a railroad spur line within the next few years. As they hitched their horses outside Peterson's general store, Nathan noticed a small gathering near the schoolhouse. Curious townspeople clustered around someone he couldn't see. "Must be the new teacher," Eliza said, her voice lilting with excitement. "Let's go introduce ourselves, Pa." Nathan shook his head. "Got business with Peterson. You go on." Eliza sighed but didn't argue. 5 years of her father's stoicism had taught her when to push and when to let be. "I'll meet you back at the store," she said before heading toward the crowd. Inside the general store, Nathan handed his supply list to Tom Peterson, a round-faced man with perpetually ink-stained fingers from counting inventory. "Morning, Nathan," Peterson said, scanning the list. "Heard you took down that wolf that was troubling the north pasture." Nathan confirmed, examining a new Bowie knife displayed under glass. "Say, have you met the new schoolteacher yet? Quite a story there. She came all the way from Philadelphia. Educated woman, too. Speaks French and plays the piano from what I hear." Nathan made a non-committal sound, but Peterson was used to carrying conversations with the taciturn rancher. "Name's Julia James. Pretty as a picture, but don't let that fool you. Got a spine of steel, that one. Stood up to old man Hargrove already when he suggested schooling wasn't important for his boys." Peterson chuckled. "Said education was more valuable than gold in this new world we're building. Hargrove didn't know whether to be offended or impressed." The bell above the door jingled, and Nathan turned to see his daughter enter with a woman he'd never seen before. The newcomer was perhaps 30, with chestnut hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. Her blue traveling dress was of good quality, but showed signs of hard wear, and though she carried herself with poise, Nathan noted the practical boots beneath her hem, not the impractical shoes city women often wore. "Pa," Eliza said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm, "this is Miss James, our new teacher." Julia James extended a gloved hand, her gaze direct and unfaltering. "Mr. Irving, I've heard much about you and your ranch. Your daughter speaks very highly of you." Nathan took her hand briefly. "Miss James," he said with a slight nod. "Miss James was just telling me about her plans for the school," Eliza continued, seemingly determined to draw her father into conversation. "She wants to start a small library and has brought books from back east." "Redemption Creek has potential," Julia said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent, but none of the condescension Nathan had come to expect from Easterners. The children here deserve the same opportunities as those in larger cities. "Noble thought," Nathan replied, then turned back to Peterson. "Need those supplies by tomorrow, Tom?" Of course," Peterson assured him. "I'll have one of the boys deliver everything." An awkward silence fell, broken when Julia spoke again. "Mr. Irving, I understand you have one of the largest ranches in the territory. I'd be grateful if you might speak to my students someday about ranching. Many of them come from ranching families, but knowing the history and science behind the work might inspire them." Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not much for speeches." Julia smiled, undeterred. "Perhaps just a demonstration then. How to properly lasso a calf or identify good grazing land, practical knowledge that might serve them well." Before Nathan could respond, the door burst open, and a young ranch hand named Riley stumbled in, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Irving, there's trouble at the north fence line. Riders were spotted cutting your wire. Looks like Blackwell's men." Nathan's expression darkened. Victor Blackwell had moved into the territory 2 years earlier, buying up smaller ranches and making no secret of his desire to expand his holdings by any means necessary. The tension between Blackwell and the established ranchers had been building for months. "Get back to the ranch," Nathan told Riley. "Tell Foreman Johnson to gather the men. I'll be right behind you." He turned to his daughter. "Eliza, you stay in town until this is settled." "But Pa—" No arguments. His tone brooked no dissent. Nathan tipped his hat to Julia. "Miss James." With that, he strode out of the store, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Julia turned to Eliza, concern evident in her eyes. "Is there anything I can do?" Eliza shook her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line so reminiscent of her father. "This has been brewing for some time. Blackwell wants our water rights, but Pa won't sell at any price. The North Pasture has the best spring in the county." "Will there be violence?" Julia asked quietly. "Pa doesn't look for trouble," Eliza replied, her gaze fixed on the door where her father had disappeared. "But he doesn't run from it either." Julia nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Your father seems formidable." "He wasn't always so hard," Eliza said softly. "Before my mother was killed, he was different. He laughed. He smiled." She looked at Julia with sudden intensity. "But I haven't seen him smile in 5 years, not once." The classroom was stifling in the late June heat, but Julia maintained her composure as she wrote multiplication tables on the blackboard. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival in Redemption Creek, and she was settling into a routine with her 27 students who ranged in age from 6 to 16. The confrontation at the Irving Ranch had ended without bloodshed this time. Nathan and his men had caught Blackwell's hands in the act of cutting fence wire, and though words and threats were exchanged, cooler heads prevailed, but everyone in town knew it was merely a postponement of the inevitable clash. Julia turned from the blackboard to find Eliza Irving standing in the doorway, a basket in her hands. "Miss Eliza," Julia greeted her with genuine warmth, "what brings you to my humble schoolhouse?" "I brought you some preserves and fresh bread," Eliza said, entering the room and placing the basket on Julia's desk. "Ma always said teaching was hungry work." "Your mother was right," Julia replied, smiling as she examined the contents of the basket, "and your timing is perfect. I was just finishing up for the day." Eliza glanced around the classroom with its neat rows of desks and colorful maps Julia had hung on the walls. "You've made this place look like a real school." "That was the idea," Julia said, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "Though I'm still hoping for those additional books I wrote for. The children are so eager to learn, but our resources are limited." "That's partly why I'm here," Eliza admitted. "Pa and I are riding to Cheyenne next week for supplies. I thought perhaps you might have a list of books or materials you need." "We could bring them back for you." Julia's face brightened. "That would be wonderful. I've been making do with what I have, but there are specific texts that would make a world of difference." As they discussed books and teaching materials, Julia couldn't help but ask, "And how is your father? Has there been any more trouble with Mr. Blackwell?" Eliza's expression clouded slightly. "Things are quiet for now. Blackwell's been in Denver on business, but he'll be back. Pa's been preparing reinforcing fences, hiring additional hands." She hesitated. "Actually, there's something else I wanted to ask you." "Of course. We're having a small gathering at the ranch this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors and hands. Pa holds one every summer. It was Ma's tradition, really, but he's kept it up. I'd like you to come." Julia blinked in surprise. "Are you certain your father would welcome my presence?" "He won't object," Eliza said, a hint of determination in her voice. "Besides, it would do him good to socialize more. He spends too much time alone with his thoughts." Julia hesitated. She had sensed, during their brief encounter, that Nathan Irving was not a man who welcomed intrusions into his carefully ordered life. Yet there was something about him that intrigued her, a depth of feeling behind the stoic exterior, perhaps. "Very well," she finally agreed. "I'd be honored to attend." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that provided welcome relief from the summer heat. Julia wore her best dress, a sage green cotton with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She had deliberated over her appearance more carefully than she cared to admit, telling herself it was merely respect for the occasion rather than any particular desire to impress her host. The Irving Ranch was impressive, a sprawling main house of solid timber and stone, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and corrals. As Julia approached in the wagon that had been sent for her, she saw smoke rising from a barbecue pit, where several men were tending to what looked like an entire steer. Eliza greeted her warmly, introducing her to neighbors and ranch hands with easy familiarity. Nathan was nowhere to be seen, but Julia found herself enjoying the company nonetheless. The people of Redemption Creek were straightforward but kind, curious about her Eastern background without being judgmental. "Miss James," a deep voice said behind her, and Julia turned to find Nathan Irving standing there, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a clean shirt and vest. His beard had been trimmed, and his hair was damp, as though he'd recently bathed. "Mr. Irving," she replied with a smile, "thank you for allowing me to join your gathering. Your home is beautiful." "Been in the family 3 generations," he said, glancing around at the property with quiet pride. "My grandfather settled here when there was nothing but wilderness and hostile tribes." "It must have taken tremendous courage and vision," Julia observed, "qualities that seem to run in your family." Something flickered in Nathan's eyes, surprise perhaps at her genuine interest. "Would you like a tour?" he asked, the offer seemingly surprising even him. "I'd like that very much." As they walked the property, Nathan gradually became more talkative, explaining the workings of the ranch, the breeding program he'd established for his cattle, the irrigation system he'd designed to make the most of the precious water resources. Julia listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her quick intelligence and genuine interest. "You know a great deal about agriculture for a schoolteacher," Nathan remarked as they stood by the corral watching several hands break in a young Mustang. "My father was a professor of agricultural science at the university," Julia explained. "He believed education should be practical as well as theoretical. I spent many summers on experimental farms." "What brought you west?" Nathan asked. "Most educated Eastern women prefer civilization." Julia's expression grew more serious. "After my parents died of influenza 2 years ago, there was little keeping me in Philadelphia. I taught at a ladies' academy, but it felt constrained. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Wyoming Territory, something called to me. A chance to build something meaningful, perhaps." Nathan studied her face, his eyes thoughtful. "It's not an easy life." "Few worthwhile things are easy, Mr. Irving," she replied. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted near the main gate. A group of riders was approaching, led by a large man with a flashy vest and an expensive hat. "Blackwell," Nathan muttered, his expression hardening instantly. "Excuse me, Miss James." Julia watched as Nathan strode toward the newcomers, his posture tense. Eliza appeared at Julia's side, her face worried. "What is he doing here?" Eliza whispered. "He wasn't invited." "I assume that's Mr. Blackwell," Julia asked, observing the newcomer's arrogant bearing and the nervous glances of his companions. Victor Blackwell, Eliza confirmed. He's been trying to force Pa to sell our water rights for months. This is a deliberate provocation coming here today. Nathan met Blackwell at the edge of the gathering, his hands resting casually near his holstered revolver. The two men spoke in low tones, though their body language spoke volumes about the tension between them. "Looks like a fine spread you have here, Irving," Blackwell was saying, his voice carrying across the yard. "Shame you don't have enough men to protect it properly. State your business and then leave." "Blackwell," Nathan replied, his voice cold. "This is a private gathering." Blackwell smiled, revealing a gold tooth. "Just being neighborly. Thought I'd let you know I've purchased the old Miller property. Makes us neighbors now." His gaze traveled past Nathan to where Julia stood with Eliza. "And who might this lovely lady be? Don't believe we've been introduced." Nathan stepped deliberately into Blackwell's line of sight. "Miss James is our school teacher, and she's none of your concern." "Everything in this territory is my concern," Blackwell replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But I won't intrude on your hospitality any longer. Enjoy your party, Irving, while you can." With a touch to his hat brim, Blackwell wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. The tension in the air remained long after they'd disappeared down the road. "What did he mean by that?" Julia asked Eliza. "It was a threat," Eliza replied grimly, "a clear one." Nathan rejoined them, his expression once again the impassive mask Julia had first encountered. "Eliza, make sure everyone has what they need. I need to speak with Johnson about increasing the night patrols." "Pa, please," Eliza implored. "Don't let him ruin the day. Ma wouldn't have wanted that." Something flashed in Nathan's eyes, pain, perhaps, or anger, but he nodded stiffly. "You're right." He turned to Julia. "I apologize for the interruption, Miss James." "No apology necessary," Julia assured him, "though I confess Mr. Blackwell strikes me as a man accustomed to getting his way." "That's about to change," Nathan replied, his voice low and determined. The remainder of the gathering passed without further incident, though Julia noticed Nathan remained vigilant, his gaze frequently scanning the horizon. As the sun began to set, guests departed one by one until only a few remained. Julia found Nathan standing alone on the porch, watching the last crimson streaks fade from the sky. "It was a lovely party, Mr. Irving," she said, joining him. "Thank you again for including me." He nodded, still looking out over his land. "Eliza was glad you came. She's taken a liking to you. The feeling is mutual. She's a remarkable young woman. You've raised her well." "Her mother did most of the raising," Nathan said quietly. "I was just trying not to undo her good work after she was gone." Julia considered her next words carefully. "If you don't mind my asking, what happened to your wife?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice low and controlled, he said, "Shot dead in town 5 years ago. Wrong place, wrong time. 2 men arguing over a card game. She was just stepping out of the mercantile." His hands gripped the porch railing tightly. "One of them missed his target, hit Catherine instead." "I'm so sorry," Julia said softly, resisting the urge to place a comforting hand on his arm. "I killed him," Nathan continued, his voice flat. "The one who fired the shot called him out right there in the street. Town marshal said it was justified." "And did it help?" Julia asked gently. "Killing him?" Nathan finally turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "No," he admitted. "Nothing's helped." The weeks that followed saw Julia settling further into life in Redemption Creek. Her students were progressing well, and she had started an evening class for adults who wished to improve their reading and mathematics. To her surprise, several ranch hands from the Irving property attended regularly. Julia found herself thinking of Nathan Irving more often than was proper. Their conversations at the gathering had revealed a man of intelligence and principle beneath the taciturn exterior. A man wounded deeply by loss, but still standing, still fighting for what he believed in. One afternoon, as Julia was dismissing her students, she looked up to find Nathan standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse, hat in hand. "Mr. Irving," she greeted him, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "This is unexpected." "Miss James." He nodded, stepping inside and glancing around the classroom with its maps and student artwork. "Eliza mentioned you were in need of some repairs to the building. I brought some tools." "That's very kind of you," Julia said, genuinely touched by the gesture. The roof leaks when it rains, and several of the window frames are loose. Nathan nodded, already examining the nearest window. Won't take long to fix. If you have other matters to attend to, I can work while you're gone. Actually, Julia replied, I'd be happy to assist. I'm not entirely helpless with a hammer. A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed Nathan's face. Somehow that doesn't surprise me, Miss James. They worked together through the afternoon, Nathan repairing the windows and roof while Julia held tools, provided measurements, and even climbed a ladder to help secure loose shingles. As they worked, conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. How did you learn carpentry? Julia asked as Nathan deftly repaired a broken desk. My father believed a man should know how to build and maintain his own place, Nathan replied. Had me helping with projects from the time I could hold a hammer. He glanced at her. You handle tools better than most city women I've met. Julia smiled. My father was similarly practical. He didn't believe in raising helpless daughters, much to my mother's occasional dismay. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the newly repaired windows, they stood back to admire their work. It looks much better, Julia said, brushing dust from her skirt. The children will be delighted. Thank you, Mr. Irving. Nathan nodded, packing his tools. Least I could do. Education's important. Catherine always said so. He hesitated. Would you care to join us for supper? Eliza's expecting me back, and she always cooks too much. Julia felt a flutter of surprise and pleasure at the invitation. I'd be delighted. The meal at the Irving Ranch was simple but delicious venison stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that Eliza had baked that morning. The conversation was comfortable, with Eliza carrying much of it, but Julia noticed that Nathan contributed more than she'd previously observed. After supper, Eliza insisted on showing Julia the family library, a cozy room lined with bookshelves that held an impressive collection for a frontier home. Ma loved to read, Eliza explained, running her fingers along the leather-bound spines. Pa would bring her books whenever he traveled to Denver or Cheyenne. Julia examined the titles with genuine interest, classics of literature, practical guides to farming and ranching, histories, and even several volumes of poetry. This is a wonderful collection. Your mother had excellent taste. You remind me of her sometimes, Eliza said quietly. The way you speak about books, about ideas. She believed in education, too. Julia felt both honored and unsettled by the comparison. I'm sure your mother was a remarkable woman. She was. The voice came from the doorway where Nathan stood watching them. Best woman I ever knew. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a deep, abiding respect. The atmosphere in Redemption Creek grew tenser as August progressed. Blackwell had indeed purchased the Miller property that bordered the Irving Ranch, and rumors swirled about his intentions. 2 smaller ranches had already sold to him after experiencing mysterious cattle losses and accidents that strained their finances. Julia found herself increasingly concerned for the Irvings. She had grown fond of Eliza, whose intelligence and determination reminded Julia of herself at that age. And Nathan. Her feelings for Nathan were more complicated, a mixture of admiration, sympathy, and something deeper she was reluctant to name. Their paths crossed frequently in the small community. Nathan had taken to stopping by the schoolhouse occasionally, ostensibly to check on the repairs or to deliver books Eliza thought Julia might enjoy. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, though Nathan maintained a certain reserve that Julia respected. One evening, as Julia was locking up the schoolhouse, she heard hoofbeats approaching rapidly. Looking up, she was surprised to see Nathan riding toward her, his expression grim. Miss James, he called, reining in his horse. You need to come with me. There's trouble brewing. What's happened? Julia asked, alarmed by the urgency in his tone. Blackwell's men have been seen watching the school. Johnson spotted them earlier today, taking particular notice of when you arrive and leave. Nathan extended his hand down to her. I don't trust their intentions. Without hesitation, Julia placed her hand in his, allowing him to pull her up behind him on the horse. She wrapped her arms around his waist as they galloped toward the Irving Ranch, her heart pounding with both fear and awareness of his solid presence before her. At the ranch, Eliza was waiting anxiously on the porch. Thank goodness, she breathed when she saw Julia. I was worried they might have gotten to you first. What exactly is happening? Julia asked as Nathan helped her dismount. Blackwell's trying a new tactic, Nathan explained, his voice hard. He's realized he can't intimidate me directly, so he's looking for leverage, people I care about. The implication of his words wasn't lost on Julia. Surely he wouldn't harm a schoolteacher simply to pressure you. Blackwell has no limits, Nathan replied grimly. 2 years ago, he burned out a family in Colorado when they wouldn't sell their mining claim, made it look like an accident. Inside the house, Julia found several of Nathan's trusted hands gathered around the table, discussing strategy. Foreman Johnson, a weathered man with keen eyes, was describing the movements of Blackwell's men. "They're getting bolder," Johnson said, "riding closer to our boundaries, watching the house, and now this interest in Miss James." "We need to send for the marshal," Eliza argued. "Marshal Parker is 3 days' ride away, dealing with trouble near the reservation," Nathan replied. "We're on our own for now." "Mr. Irving," Julia interjected, "while I appreciate your concern, I can't simply hide away at your ranch. I have responsibilities to my students." Nathan's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "I understand that, but I'm asking you to stay here tonight, at least until we can arrange proper protection for you in town." The look in his eyes' concern, mixed with something deeper, made Julia's resistance fade. "Very well," she agreed. "One night." That evening, after a tense supper during which plans were made for increased security around both the ranch and the school, Julia found herself unable to sleep in the guest room Eliza had prepared. Rising quietly, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way downstairs, intending to find a book to distract her troubled thoughts. She was surprised to find Nathan in the library, sitting in a leather chair with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the dying embers of the fire. "I'm sorry," she said softly from the doorway. "I didn't mean to intrude." Nathan glanced up, and for a moment, vulnerability showed plainly on his face before his usual reserve reasserted itself. "Can't sleep?" "No," Julia admitted, entering the room. "My mind won't quiet." Nathan nodded toward the chair opposite his. "Join me, if you like." Julia settled into the chair, tucking her feet beneath her. For a few moments they sat in comfortable silence, watching the glowing coals. "I'm sorry you've been drawn into this," Nathan finally said. "It's my fight, not yours." "I chose to come west," Julia replied. "I knew it wouldn't be without risks, and besides," she hesitated, then continued more softly, "I've come to care about what happens to you and Eliza." Nathan's gaze lifted to meet hers, something indefinable in his eyes. "Why?" The simple question caught Julia off guard. Because you're good people. Because what Blackwell is doing is wrong. Because—" She trailed off, unsure how to express the growing feelings she harbored for this complex, wounded man. "Julia," he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her. "You should know that I haven't let anyone close since Catherine died. Not in that way." "I'm not asking anything of you, Nathan," she replied gently, "but I won't pretend I don't care." The tension between them stretched, a living thing filled with possibility and fear. Then Nathan set his glass down and stood. "It's late. You should try to rest." Julia nodded, recognizing his retreat. "Good night, then." As she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Julia," she turned to face him. "Thank you. For caring." The next morning brought no respite from the tension. Nathan and Johnson rode out at dawn to check the northern boundary, where one of the hands had reported suspicious activity during the night. Eliza and Julia spent the morning in the kitchen, preparing food and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy through mundane tasks. "He cares for you, you know," Eliza said abruptly, as they kneaded bread dough side by side. Julia's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "Your father is a kind man beneath his reserve. He cares for many people." Eliza shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Not like this. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. I haven't seen that look since before Ma died." "Eliza," Julia began, uncertain how to respond, "even if that were true, your father has made it clear he's not ready to move forward." "Pa's always been stubborn," Eliza replied, her expression fondly exasperated. "But he's also fair. He won't let himself acknowledge what's happening between you two until this business with Blackwell is settled. He thinks it wouldn't be right to court you while you might be in danger because of him." Julia felt her cheeks warm at the directness of the young woman's words. "Court me? I think that's presuming a great deal." Eliza just smiled knowingly and continued kneading her dough. The sound of approaching riders drew them to the window. Nathan and Johnson had returned, their expressions grave as they dismounted. "What is it?" Eliza asked as they entered the kitchen. "What's happened?" "Blackwell's made his move," Nathan said grimly. "He's dammed the creek that feeds our north pasture. The water's already drying up." "Can he do that legally?" Julia asked. Johnson snorted. "Legal don't mean much out here, Miss James. But no, it ain't legal. That water's subject to prior appropriation rights, and the Irving claim predates Blackwell's purchase by 30 years. "I'm riding to Cheyenne," Nathan announced, "going to telegraph Judge Wilson and file a formal complaint, maybe bring back the federal marshal." "That'll take days," Eliza protested. "The cattle need water now." "Johnson will take some men tonight to dismantle that dam," Nathan replied. "I don't want anyone getting shot, so we'll do it legal first, force second, and guns last." "And what about Miss James?" Johnson asked. "Blackwell's men are still watching the school." Nathan's gaze met Julia's. "I've arranged for Mrs. Peterson to stay with Miss James at the teacherage. Her husband and sons will keep watch, and school will be suspended until I return with the marshal." "That's unacceptable," Julia said firmly. "The children shouldn't miss their education because of this dispute." "Better missing lessons than attending your funeral," Nathan replied bluntly. Julia bristled at his tone. "I won't be intimidated, Mr. Irving, not by Blackwell and not by you." For a moment they stared at each other in tense silence. Then, unexpectedly, a corner of Nathan's mouth twitched upward, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to it Julia had seen. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but there was a hint of admiration in his voice. A compromise was reached. School would continue. But classes would be held at the church in the center of town, where more people could keep watch, and Julia would be escorted to and from the building by armed men Nathan trusted. Nathan departed for Cheyenne that afternoon after seeing Julia safely installed at the teacherage with Mrs. Peterson. His farewell was brief, almost formal, but his eyes lingered on her face as though memorizing her features. "Be careful," Julia told him softly. "Always am," he replied. Then, more quietly, "Wait for me." The simple request contained volumes of unspoken meaning. Julia nodded. "I will." The next 3 days passed in a state of heightened tension. Julia conducted her classes as normally as possible, though she noticed several of her students were absent, kept home by fearful parents. Johnson and 2 of Nathan's hands successfully dismantled Blackwell's dam under cover of darkness, restoring water flow to the north pasture, but everyone knew it was only a temporary victory. On the 4th day, as Julia was dismissing her students, she looked up to see Victor Blackwell himself standing in the doorway of the church, flanked by 2 hard-faced men. "Miss James," Blackwell said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Victor Blackwell, at your service." Julia straightened her spine, keeping her voice steady. "My students are just leaving, Mr. Blackwell. Perhaps we could speak outside." Blackwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I think we're fine right here. Children should learn about business negotiations. Educational, wouldn't you say?" The last of the students hurried past Blackwell, several casting worried glances back at their teacher. When they were gone, Julia moved to stand behind her desk, maintaining as much distance as possible between herself and the intruders. "What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked coolly. "I understand you've become quite close to the Irving family," Blackwell said, strolling into the room and examining the maps on the wall with feigned interest, particularly to Nathan Irving himself. "My relationships are none of your concern," Julia replied. Blackwell turned to face her, his pretense of civility dropping away. "Everything in this territory that affects my business is my concern, Miss James, and Nathan Irving is standing in the way of my business. If you've come to threaten me, Mr. Blackwell, you're wasting your time. I have no influence over Mr. Irving's business decisions." Blackwell laughed, a harsh sound that sent a chill down Julia's spine. Oh, I think you underestimate yourself, Miss James. A man like Irving doesn't let many people close, but he's let you in, and that makes you valuable. I believe this conversation is over, Julia said, gathering her papers with hands she fought to keep steady. Please leave. Blackwell moved suddenly, closing the distance between them and gripping her arm. You'll deliver a message to Irving when he returns. Tell him I'm offering one last chance to sell his water rights, a generous price. If he refuses, his grip tightened painfully. Well, Redemption Creek might find itself needing a new schoolteacher. Take your hands off her. The voice from the doorway was cold as ice and hard as steel. Julia looked up in surprise to see Nathan standing there, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, his eyes deadly calm. Blackwell released Julia's arm but didn't step back. Irving. Back sooner than expected. Step away from her, Nathan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Now. The two men flanking Blackwell shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their weapons. We were just having a friendly conversation, Blackwell said, smiling thinly. Isn't that right, Miss James? Mr. Blackwell was just leaving, Julia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then the church door opened again, and several men entered Marshal Parker, looking trail-worn but alert, followed by Tom Peterson and several other townsmen. Everything all right here, Irving? The marshal asked, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. Mr. Blackwell was explaining his business tactics, Nathan replied, not taking his eyes off the rancher. Seems to involve threatening school teachers. Marshal Parker's expression hardened. That's so, Blackwell? A misunderstanding, Blackwell said smoothly. I merely came to pay my respects to our esteemed educator. Well, you've paid them, the marshal replied. Now I suggest you and your men head back to your property. I've got some federal papers that'll be of interest to you, but that can wait till morning. Blackwell's jaw tightened, but he recognized the shift in power. With a curt nod, he strode past Nathan and the marshal, his men following close behind. Once they were gone, Nathan crossed quickly to Julia. Are you hurt? He asked, his eyes searching her face. No, she assured him, though she rubbed her arm where Blackwell's grip had left marks. Just shaken. You arrived at a rather opportune moment. Made good time from Cheyenne, Nathan said, his gaze still concerned. Had a feeling Blackwell might try something while I was gone. Marshal Parker approached, extending his hand to Julia. Madam, sorry about that. Blackwell's been causing trouble up and down the territory. Judge Wilson's issued an injunction against his damming of Irving's water supply, and I've got warrants for 2 of his men for cattle rustling over in Johnson County. Thank you, Marshal, Julia said sincerely. Will that be enough to stop him? Might slow him down, the marshal replied honestly. Men like Blackwell, though, they don't stop easy. After the marshal and the townsmen departed, Nathan insisted on escorting Julia back to the teacherage. They walked in silence for several minutes, Julia acutely aware of his protective presence beside her. I was worried, Nathan finally said, his voice low, when I rode up and saw Blackwell's horse outside the church. I'm fine, Julia assured him again. Truly. Nathan stopped walking, turning to face her directly. In the golden light of the setting sun, his features seemed softer somehow, the hard lines of grief and determination momentarily eased. When Catherine died, he said abruptly, I thought that was it for me. Didn't see the point in opening myself up to that kind of pain again. Figured I'd just focus on the ranch, on raising Eliza, and let the rest go. Julia remained silent, sensing he needed to speak without interruption. Then you came to town, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. With your books and your ideas and your courage. Made me remember there's more to life than just surviving it. He took a deep breath. I'm not good with words, Julia. Never have been. But I need you to know that if anything happened to you. Nothing's going to happen to me, Julia said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. I'm not going anywhere, Nathan. His gaze held hers, a tumult of emotions visible in his eyes. I can't offer you much beyond a hard life on a frontier ranch. Can't promise there won't be more trouble. Can't even promise I won't have dark days when the memories hit hard. I'm not asking for promises, Julia replied. Just honesty. And perhaps a chance. Nathan nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. Then, with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior, he reached out to touch her cheek. A chance, then. The confrontation with Blackwell came to a head 3 days later. Despite the marshal's warnings and the legal injunction, Blackwell's men rebuilt the dam under cover of darkness. When Nathan and his hands rode out to dismantle it again, they found Blackwell waiting with a dozen armed men. Word reached town quickly. Julia was in the middle of a grammar lesson when Tom Peterson burst into the classroom. "Miss James," he said urgently, "there's trouble at the North Pasture. Blackwell's men and Irving's are facing off. Marshall's riding out, but there's talk of shooting already started." Julia's heart froze in her chest. "Children," she said, fighting to keep her voice calm, "class is dismissed early today. Go directly home and stay there until your parents come for you." As her students filed out, Julia gathered her skirts and hurried toward the livery stable. Propriety be damned, she wasn't going to sit in town waiting to hear if Nathan had been killed. "I need a horse," she told the livery owner, "the fastest you have." "Miss James, you can't be thinking of riding out there," the man protested. "It's no place for a woman." "The horse, Mr. Collins," Julia repeated firmly. "Now, please." 20 minutes later, Julia was galloping toward the North Pasture, her hair coming loose from its pins, her heart pounding with fear and determination. As she crested a hill overlooking the pasture, she saw them 2 groups of men on horseback facing each other across the shallow creek. Even from a distance, she could recognize Nathan's tall figure at the front of one group, Blackwell's stocky form leading the other. The marshal was there too, positioned between the groups, apparently trying to negotiate. But even as Julia watched, Blackwell gestured angrily, and one of his men raised a rifle. Without thinking, Julia urged her horse forward, racing down the hill toward the confrontation. "Stop!" she shouted as she approached. "Stop this madness!" All heads turned at the sound of her voice. Nathan's face, when he saw her, registered shock and then fear. "Julia, get back!" he called. But Julia rode directly into the space between the 2 groups, reining in beside the marshal. "There's been enough violence in this territory," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Enough blood spilled over land and water and pride." "This isn't your fight, Miss James," Blackwell sneered. "Best ride back to your schoolhouse." "When armed men threaten to kill each other over water rights, it becomes everyone's fight," Julia replied steadily. "There are children in Redemption Creek who need fathers to come home alive today." "Julia," Nathan said urgently, maneuvering his horse closer to hers, "please go back to town." "No," she said firmly. "I won't stand by while you risk your life over a dam in a creek." Marshal Parker, seizing the moment of distraction, spoke up. "Blackwell, I've got warrants for 3 of your men. You interfere with me serving those warrants, you'll be facing federal charges yourself." Blackwell's face darkened with rage. "This isn't over, Irving," he spat. "Woman or no woman, marshal or no marshal." "Actually, it is over," came a new voice. Everyone turned to see a group of riders approaching from the east, a distinguished-looking man in a suit accompanied by several uniformed soldiers. "Judge Wilson," the marshal acknowledged with evident relief. "Didn't expect you to ride out personally." "Situation warranted it," the judge replied, his stern gaze fixed on Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell, I've reviewed the water rights dispute between yourself and Mr. Irving. The law is clear. Irving's prior appropriation rights take precedence over your claims." "The law is whatever the strongest man says it is out here," Blackwell retorted. The judge's expression hardened. "Perhaps that was true once, not anymore. This territory is moving toward statehood, Mr. Blackwell. Rule of law matters now." He gestured to the soldiers accompanying him. "Captain Reynolds and his men will ensure that the injunction is enforced. The dam comes down today, and it stays down." Blackwell looked around, calculating his options. With soldiers present and several of his men now facing arrest, his position had weakened considerably. "This territory's changing for the worse," he muttered. "Used to be a man could make his own way without government interference." "A man can still make his own way," Nathan said, speaking up for the first time since Julia's arrival. "Just not at the expense of others who've worked the land honestly." Blackwell spat on the ground, then wheeled his horse around. "Keep your damn water, Irving. Plenty more opportunities elsewhere." With a curt gesture to his remaining men, he rode away, leaving his wanted men to face the marshal's justice. As the tension of the standoff dissipated, Nathan rode immediately to Julia's side. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, his voice a mixture of anger and admiration. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Julia replied steadily. "I couldn't just wait in town, not knowing." Something shifted in Nathan's eyes, then a softening, a surrender of sorts. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you couldn't." That evening, after the dam had been dismantled and the creek was flowing freely again, a small celebration gathered at the Irving Ranch. Judge Wilson, Marshal Parker, and several of the townspeople joined in the impromptu feast Eliza prepared to mark what everyone hoped was the end of Blackwell's threat. As twilight descended, Julia found herself standing on the porch, gazing out at the vast Wyoming landscape bathed in the day's fading light. The sound of footsteps alerted her to Nathan's presence as he joined her. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I was thinking about how beautiful it is here," Julia replied honestly. "How worth fighting for." Nathan nodded, his gaze following hers across the rolling pastures to the distant mountains. "When my grandfather first came here, this was all wilderness. He wrote to my grandmother back east that he'd found a piece of heaven and needed her to come make it home." "She came?" Julia asked. "Traveled 6 months by wagon train, nearly died crossing the Platte. But she came." Nathan turned to look at Julia, his expression open in a way she'd never seen before. "Brave women have always been the making of this family." Julia's heart quickened at the implication of his words. "Nathan, I'm not good at this," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "Been too long since I tried, but I know that when I saw you ride into that standoff today, I was terrified, not just of losing you, but of losing the chance to tell you." He trailed off, searching for words. "Tell me what?" Julia prompted gently. "That you've brought something back to life in me," he said simply. "Something I thought died with Catherine. And I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't feel it." Julia reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "I feel it too." Nathan's grip tightened on hers. "I can't promise it'll be easy. Ranch life is hard, and I've been told I'm not the most sociable man." A smile touched Julia's lips. "I haven't noticed." For the first time since she'd known him, a genuine smile transformed Nathan's face, not a full grin, but a softening of his features that reached his eyes and erased years of grief for just a moment. The sight of it made Julia's breath catch. From the doorway behind them came Eliza's voice. "Pa, are you smiling?" Nathan turned, his hand still clasping Julia's. "Maybe," he said, the smile lingering in his eyes as he looked from his daughter to the woman beside him. Eliza's own face broke into a radiant grin. "I knew it," she said softly. "I knew she could make you smile again." 2 years later, the Irving Ranch had prospered despite the challenges that frontier life inevitably brought. Blackwell had indeed left the territory, moving on to Colorado where, rumor had it, his tactics had finally landed him in federal prison. The ranch house had been expanded to include a proper library where Julia continued to teach several of the neighboring children whose families lived too far from town to attend the school regularly. Her position as Redemption Creek's schoolteacher had been filled by a capable young man from Denver, allowing Julia to divide her time between education and her new role as Nathan's wife. On a crisp autumn morning, Julia stood on the porch watching Nathan and Eliza working with a spirited young colt in the corral. At 30 months, James Nathan Irving, named for Julia's father, and his own toddled beside her, clutching her skirt with one hand and pointing excitedly at the horses with the other. "Horse!" the boy exclaimed, his vocabulary expanding daily in a way that filled Julia with pride. "Yes, darling," she agreed, lifting him into her arms so he could see better. "Your father and sister are teaching that horse to trust them." Nathan glanced up, catching sight of them watching. He said something to Eliza, handed her the lead rope, and walked toward the porch, removing his gloves as he approached. "How are my favorite teacher and my favorite son?" he asked, his voice warm with affection as he climbed the steps. "Eagerly awaiting their favorite rancher," Julia replied, smiling as Nathan leaned in to kiss her softly. Little James reached for his father, and Nathan took him in his strong arms, lifting the boy high above his head to elicit delighted giggles. Letter came from the Wilsons, Julia said, referring to the judge and his wife who had become friends. Statehood is looking more certain. The territory may be admitted to the Union within the next year or two. Nathan nodded thoughtfully, settling James on his hip. Times are changing fast. Railroads coming through next spring. Town council's talking about electric lights for Main Street. Do you mind it? Julia asked. The changes. Nathan considered this, looking out over the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. Some changes are hard, he admitted, but others. His gaze returned to her face, his eyes soft with an emotion that never failed to move her. Some changes save a man's soul. Julia reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines at the corners of his eyes, lines that now creased as often in laughter as in concern. You've been smiling more lately, she observed. Eliza mentioned it yesterday. Got reasons to, Nathan replied simply, leaning into her touch. Got a fine son, a daughter soon to marry a decent man, the best land in the territory, and a wife who still reads poetry by candlelight. Speaking of Eliza's wedding, Julia said, she wants to move the date up to spring instead of waiting until next fall. Says she and Robert have waited long enough. Nathan grimaced slightly. Still getting used to the idea of her married at all. But Robert's a good man, works hard, respects her mind. Like father, like daughter, Julia teased gently. She wouldn't settle for less. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Eliza was riding toward them, her face alight with the joy that seemed her natural expression these days. Pa! Julia, she called as she dismounted. Thunder's ready for you to try him. He's responding beautifully to the training. What do you think, James? Nathan asked his son. Should we go see the horse? Horse, James confirmed enthusiastically. As they walked together toward the corral, Julia's hand tucked in the crook of Nathan's arm, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place from the refined parlors of Philadelphia to the wild beauty of Wyoming Territory, from a solitary teacher to a wife, mother, and integral part of a community. She had come west seeking purpose and found not only that, but love, family, and a home. Nathan had found healing for wounds he thought would never close, and together they had built something neither could have imagined alone, a life as vast and promising as the western horizon, as enduring as the mountains that watched over their land. As if reading her thoughts, Nathan glanced down at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Happy? He asked simply. Julia nodded, her heart full. More than I ever thought possible. The smile that spread across his face, no longer rare, but still precious, was all the answer she needed.